Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. The morning my father said, "Do not start without me," I believed he was on the road. He actually meant my sister's engagement party was running late. By sunset, I married the love of my life, facing empty chairs while my family clink-kicked champagne glasses downtown for a performance disguised as love. 2 weeks later, a single honeymoon photo exposed everything they'd bet against. Suddenly, the people who could not spare me one afternoon remembered my number. My name is Brooklyn Harrison. I am 32 years old, and for as long as I can recall, my primary function in the world has been to ensure that the machinery around me runs quietly and without incident. I currently live in Chattanooga, a city where the air settles, heavy in the valleys, and people generally mind their own business. By day, I work as a senior compliance coordinator at Ironroot Systems, a private firm specializing in travel risk software. My profession is essentially the art of anticipating disaster. I spend my hours looking for loopholes, structural liabilities, and blind spots in massive corporate travel frameworks. I am highly competent. I am meticulous and precise. I am the person who fixes the catastrophic errors that nobody else in the building even notices. And inevitably, I am the one who receives absolutely zero thanks when the crisis is successfully averted. That is the fundamental nature of compliance work. When you execute your job perfectly, nothing happens. No alarms sound in the hallways and no celebratory parades are thrown in your honor. It is a quiet, invisible kind of success, and I have always been entirely comfortable with invisibility. It was, after all, the exact role I was conditioned to play since my childhood. In the Harrison family, there was only ever enough room for one main event, and her name was Tinsley. My older sister has been the undisputed golden child since we were in high school. Tinsley is undeniably beautiful, possessing a kind of striking features that force strangers to turn their heads. But her true talent is profoundly performative. She is socially magnetic in a way that exhausts my spirit, but mesmerizes everyone else in her orbit. She does not merely enter a room. She dictates its weather and demands its attention. For 2 decades, our parents, Wade and Eller Harrison, have operated like a deeply devoted stage crew for Tinsley's unfolding drama. Every holiday gathering, every vacation budget, and every major family decision has been carefully rearranged to accommodate Tinsley's shifting moods, her manufactured milestones, and her meticulously curated public image. If Tinsley demanded a destination graduation trip, we quietly skipped Christmas gifts that year to fund it. If Tinsley was navigating a dramatic romantic breakup, my academic achievements were swiftly swept off the dinner table so we could focus the evening entirely on her emotional healing. Growing up in that house, I quickly learned the currency of survival. I absorbed the lesson early on that my role was to be the easy one. I was constantly praised for being reasonable and mature. For many years, I wore those adjectives like heavy badges of honor, failing to realize until I was well into my 20s that being called mature by your parents is often just a polite, sanitized way of thanking you for swallowing your disappointment before anyone has to witness it. I became the daughter who required absolutely no maintenance, the one who was always expected to understand why there was never quite enough time, enough money, or enough attention left over for her. Then I met Dean Mercer. Dean is a quiet man, profoundly disciplined, and entirely unimpressed by the superficial things that endlessly dazzle my family. He is a software founder, though he would never introduce himself that way at a crowded dinner party or a networking event. He built a complex hotel fraud detection platform called Room Trace entirely from scratch, operating out of a rented duplex with uneven floorboards, utilizing a cheap folding desk and a coffee maker that constantly leaked water onto the counter. When I fell in love with him, I fell in love with his absolute stillness. Dean does not need to announce his presence to feel validated. He wakes up at 5 in the morning, works diligently for 10 hours straight, and simply exists with a quiet confidence that requires no audience. Naturally, the Harrison family dismissed him instantly. To wait in a lane, success is a highly visible metric. It is something you wear on your wrist, something you part in a driveway, or a prestigious title you casually drop into a country club conversation to establish dominance. Dean works remotely from our living room. He actively avoids bragging about his intellect or his bank account. He dresses plainly in solid colors and well-worn denim, and he completely refuses to perform the concept of success in a language my parents can comprehend. They looked at his quiet demeanor and his lack of a shiny corporate badge, and they immediately categorized him as a failure or at best a temporary placeholder in my life until I found someone more presentable. They never bothered to ask what Room Trace actually did or how many late nights Dean spent writing complex code that protected millions of dollars in hospitality transactions. They only saw what he was not projecting. The climax of their disdain crystallized at Thanksgiving, hosted at my aunt's sprawling house in Franklin, Tennessee. We were seated around a massive oak dining table, the air thick with the smell of roasted turkey, expensive wine, and the sharp edge of passive aggression. The house was full of cousins, gossiping, and relatives eager to showcase their latest acquisitions. Wade, holding a heavy crystal wine glass, looked directly across the table at Dean. The room happened to grow quiet, just long enough for his voice to carry perfectly over the clinking of silverware. So Dean, my father, started, wearing a tight smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "When are you going to wrap up this little computer project of yours and get a real job with a payroll department and an office key?" The entire table erupted into laughter. It was not a gentle chuckle. It was a loud, unified dismissal. My mother laughed softly, taking the delicate sip of her white wine, as if Wade had just delivered a brilliant punchline. Tinsley smirked, leaning into her own reflection in the nearest dining-room mirror, completely unbothered by the cruelty of the moment. I froze completely. I felt the hot blood rushing to my ears, my hands gripping the linen napkin in my lap, until my knuckles turned bone white. I was the only person in the room not laughing. I braced myself, waiting for Dean to snap, to rightfully defend himself, to list the revenue his platform was quietly generating, or to simply walk out the front door. Instead, Dean stayed perfectly calm. He did not flush with embarrassment or raise his voice. He took a slow, measured breath, met my father's condescending gaze directly, and answered politely, "I am actually quite happy with where my project is heading, sir, but I appreciate your concern." He did not seek validation from anyone at that table. A moment later, I felt his warm hand find mine under the heavy wood of the table. He gave my trembling fingers a firm, steadying squeeze. In that one silent, grounding gesture, Dean demonstrated more dignity and grace than my entire family had managed to muster in over 30 years of speech. He anchored me to reality while my family floated away on their own arrogance. A few months later, during a rainy weekend trip to a secluded rented cabin tucked deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Dean asked me to marry him. The rain had been falling steadily for 48 hours, trapping us inside with nothing but a crackling fire and the sound of water hitting the tin roof. There were no hidden photographers waiting in the bushes, no extravagant set pieces designed for social media consumption, and no audience to applaud. It was just the two of us sitting on a worn sofa and a sincere promise that felt as solid and immovable as the mountain ground beneath my feet. I said yes with tears streaming down my face, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of safety that I had never experienced in my childhood home. And yet, as we packed our bags and drove back down the winding mountain roads the next morning, staring out at the thick fog rolling gracefully through the ancient trees, a small, foolish hope ignited deep inside my chest. Despite my history, despite the Thanksgiving humiliation, and entirely against my better judgment, I let myself believe that a wedding might finally change things. I believe that just this once, for one single afternoon in my entire life, my family might actually look at the two daughters they raised and choose me. Dean and I decided on a late spring wedding. We did not want a grand ballroom, a 5-course plated dinner, or a towering cake that cost more than our first car. Instead, we found a beautiful secluded cedar lodge tucked into the dense Green Mountains just outside Asheville, North Carolina. The vision was incredibly simple and completely ours. We planned for exactly 56 chairs arranged on a grassy bluff overlooking the valley. We wanted the sharp, clean scent of mountain air, hundreds of warm string lights draped through the ancient pine branches and handwritten vows that actually meant something. There would be no waste, no performative spectacle, and no manufactured drama. It was designed to be an intimate gathering of people who genuinely cared about us, a quiet celebration of a quiet love. The beauty of the wedding was in its personal touches. Dean, who spent his days writing complex software code, spent his weekends in the cramped backyard of our rented duplex covered in sawdust. He decided to build our wedding arbor himself. He sourced heavy, reclaimed barnwood from a local salvage yard, carefully sanding down the rough edges and staining the timber until it glowed a rich, warm brown. Watching him work, measuring every angle with quiet precision, made me love him even more. Meanwhile, I spent my evenings at our small kitchen table, designing and writing out every single invitation by hand. I chose thick textured cotton paper and mixed my own dark green ink. My fingers were constantly stained, but I cherished the process. I loved our wedding precisely because it felt deeply personal and grounded in reality rather than serving as an expensive exercise in public relations. During this planning phase, my father called me on a Tuesday evening. His voice sounded surprisingly thick with emotion. He told me unprompted that he was going to walk me down the aisle. He did not just say it once. He repeated it 3 times during our brief conversation. He spoke with a firm, almost defensive tone, as if he were trying to convince himself just as much as he was trying to convince me. I thanked him, my throat suddenly tight. I took that promise and carefully tucked it away in my heart. I clung to it like something incredibly fragile, a delicate piece of blown glass that I desperately did not want to test or examine too closely, terrified that if I applied even the slightest pressure, it would shatter completely. My fragile piece did not last long. Barely 3 weeks after my engagement became public knowledge among our extended relatives, the familial spotlight was aggressively seized and redirected. Tinsley announced her own engagement. She did not just get engaged to anyone. She got engaged to Grant Wexler. Grant was the polished, impeccably groomed heir to the Wexler family, a wealthy dynasty that owned a string of boutique luxury hotels across the South. Where Dean was quiet and self-made, Grant was loud, heavily funded, and entirely a product of generational wealth. He wore custom-tailored suits to casual Sunday brunches and spoke in corporate buzzwords that my parents found incredibly intoxicating. Almost immediately, the powerful gravitational pull of the Wexler family began dragging the Harrisons into their orbit. Grant did not merely propose to my sister. He effectively purchased my parents' loyalty. Within a month, Grant magically found my father a highly paid consulting role within one of the Wexler development projects. I never quite understood what Wade actually consulted on, but the paychecks were substantial enough to change his entire posture. Shortly after that, Elaine was somehow included on a premium corporate health insurance plan tied to a Wexler holding company. Overnight, Tinsley's romance ceased to be a simple family milestone and transformed into the family's entire financial weather system. The Harrisons' economic comfort was now directly tethered to Tinsley's ability to keep Grant Wexler happy. The shift in family dynamics was swift and brutal. Suddenly, every single conversation I tried to have about my upcoming wedding in Asheville was expertly hijacked and redirected. If I called my mother on a Sunday afternoon to mention that Dean and I had finalized our barbecue catering menu, there would be a brief polite pause before the pivot. "Oh, barbecue sounds very rustic and easy, Brooklyn," Elaine would say, her voice dripping with practiced, condescending warmth. "Speaking of food, did Tinsley tell you that Grant's mother is flying in white truffles from Italy for their rehearsal dinner? It is just a completely different scale of entertaining. And have you seen the clarity on Tinsley's ring yet?" Grant had the diamond sourced from a private dealer in Antwerp. I learned to simply grip the phone tighter and murmur my agreements. Conversations about my Cedar Lodge evaporated, replaced entirely by endless updates regarding Tinsley's venue ideas, Tinsley's high society future, and Tinsley's increasingly elite social calendar. My wedding was treated like a quaint, charming little arts and crafts project, while Tinsley's wedding was treated like a royal coronation. To her credit, Tinsley did make a minimal effort to perform the role of a supportive sister. She called me one afternoon, her voice buzzing with frantic energy, and offered vague, sweeping gestures of assistance. She promised to help me coordinate the floral deliveries and look over my seating chart. She sounded incredibly generous for exactly 10 minutes. Then she vanished. She stopped answering my texts about flower arrangements and ignored my emails about the timeline. She disappeared completely into the whirlwind of her own life. In many ways, her silent absence unnerved me far more than her open criticism ever could have. Open criticism meant she was at least paying attention. Total abandonment meant I did not even register on her radar. Back in Chattanooga, Dean was dealing with his own shifting landscape. He was as steady and loving as ever, but I noticed a new intense focus in his routine. He started taking a string of quiet phone calls on our narrow back porch, pacing back and forth while speaking in hushed, measured tones. He flew out of state 2 separate times within a single month, packing his small duffel bag in the dark hours before dawn. When I asked him if everything was all right with room trace, he walked over, wrapped his arms around my waist, and kissed my forehead. "Everything is perfectly fine," he assured me, his voice calm and solid. "It is just some contract-related business. A lot of moving parts right now. I promise I will explain everything to you the minute I am legally allowed to do so." I trusted Dean completely. He had never given me a single reason to doubt his integrity. So I nodded, let the subject drop, and went back to addressing envelopes. When the time finally came, I gathered the 56 thick hand-dressed envelopes containing our save-the-dates. I walked them down to the post office myself, feeling a genuine surge of joy as I handed them over the counter. I imagined my aunts, uncles, and cousins opening them, seeing the dark green ink and the rustic cedar trees I had painstakingly drawn. I expected a flurry of text messages. I expected phone calls. I expected the family group chat to light up with heart emojis and questions about mountain cabins. Instead, there was nothing. Days passed, and a heavy, suffocating silence settled over my phone. No one mentioned the beautiful paper. No one asked about booking accommodations in Asheville. The family group chat remained entirely focused on Grant's upcoming birthday gala. I sat on my living room sofa, staring at the dark screen of my phone, and a cold realization began to wash over me. I sensed it almost physically, a tight knot forming in the pit of my stomach. The absolute silence for my family did not feel like the natural lull of busy people. It felt deliberate. It felt sharp. It felt significantly less like peace and entirely like a setup. The silence that followed my save-the-dates was not an administrative oversight. It was a quarantine. The truth did not arrive with a dramatic confrontation. It slipped out through a casual phone call with my Aunt Mara on a Tuesday afternoon. Mara had always been the family sieve, entirely incapable of holding water or secrets. She called to ask about hotel blocks, but her geography was completely wrong. She asked if Dean and I had secured rooms near the downtown district, specifically mentioning the valet parking situation off Broadway. I stopped wiping down my kitchen counter. I asked her why she was looking at hotels in Nashville when the lodge was in North Carolina. Mara paused. The silence on the line was thick and suffocating. She stammered, then finally confessed that she was looking at the itinerary for Tinsley's engagement party. She read the details aloud to me. The party was scheduled for the exact same Saturday as my wedding. It was set to begin at 6:00 in the evening on the rooftop of the flagship Wexler Hotel. I did the math in my head instantly. The drive between Nashville and Asheville is nearly 5 hours on a clear highway. There was no logistical miracle that could bridge that gap. The scheduling was a zero-sum game. Anyone choosing to stand on that rooftop holding a flute of imported champagne was in plain English choosing not to sit in a cedar chair and watch me get married. I hung up the phone and dialed my sister. I expected a flurry of apologies, perhaps a frantic excuse about a misunderstood calendar. Instead, Tinsley answered on the second ring, sounding completely serene. When I asked her about the date, her response was so polished it felt rehearsed in front of a mirror. She spoke of venue availability and media scheduling. She used words like synergy and press cycles. You have to understand how these things happen in real life. Brooklyn, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. Grant's public relations team only had this one weekend available before the fourth quarter push. We simply could not turn it down. Besides, your event is so intimate. I knew you would not mind keeping it low-key. I ended the call without screaming. Screaming implies a loss of control, and my professional life is built on maintaining control when complex systems fail. I began pulling at the threads of the timeline. The first thread unraveled quickly. I discovered that Tinsley's heavy foil-stamped engagement invitations had been mailed out a full 2 weeks before I sent my handmaid save the dates. She had known my wedding date for 4 entire months. She had locked her date, booked the Wexler rooftop, and dispatched her invitations while actively letting me sit at my kitchen table drawing cedar trees in dark green ink. The sheer mechanics of the betrayal required coordination. I needed to see the blueprint. That evening, my closest friend, Naomi Porter, came over to my duplex. Naomi is a public defender. She spends her days cross-examining hostile witnesses and tearing apart flimsy alibis. She is blunt, fiercely loyal, and most importantly, she had never been removed from the Sproul and Harrison extended family group chat. She walked into my kitchen, dropped her leather briefcase on the floor, and slid her phone across the table. It was open to a photo album containing dozens of screenshots. She laid them out for me like evidence in a deposition. "I have been compiling this since Tuesday," Naomi said, her voice flat and professional. "You need to see exactly how they engineered this." The screenshots exposed a meticulously organized pressure campaign. Tinsley had not simply sent out invitations. She had executed a targeted lobbying effort. She called our aunts, uncles, and cousins one by one. The text summarized her talking points. She systematically reduced my wedding to just a little mountain weekend, a casual getaway that could be missed without consequence. In the same breath, she elevated her engagement party into a mandatory networking event. She promised appearances by influential investors, old money national guests, and prominent press outlets tied to the Wexler brand name for a family addicted to social climbing. She was offering them an exclusive elevator up. I scrolled through the messages, watching my relatives negotiate their attendance. I saw them weighing my quiet commitment against Tinsley's high society spectacle. It was a brutal calculus, and I was losing in every single exchange. Then Naomi tapped the screen and opened one final image. It was a direct exchange between Tinsley and my father. It had been mistakenly sent to the larger group chat and quickly deleted, but Naomi had caught it. Wade had texted Tinsley to express a fleeting moment of paternal hesitation. "Are we certain about doing this on the exact same weekend?" He had written, "It feels a bit harsh on your sister." Tinsley's reply was a surgical strike against my humanity. "Do not worry about Brooklyn," she typed. "She will get over it because she always does." I stared at those 10 words until the glowing letters blurred. That was the core of it. Tinsley had successfully weaponized my own resilience against me. My entire life of being reasonable, of swallowing disappointment, of demanding nothing so my parents could have an easier time had not earned their respect. It had only taught them that my pain was a permanent, exploitable resource. They believed I was simply a vessel built to absorb their selfishness without cracking. I handed the phone back to Naomi. I felt completely hollowed out, as if a surgeon had gone in and removed my heart, leaving only cold air in my chest. The next morning, I called Wade. I asked him directly how he planned to attend both a 600 party in Nashville and a 500 ceremony in Asheville. He panicked. He dodged every direct question, stammering about Grant's demanding schedule and the complexities of the consulting role the Wexlers had provided him. He used a lot of words to say absolutely nothing. I called Elaine next. She sighed heavily into the receiver, sounding inconvenienced by my grief. "Please, Brooklyn, do not be dramatic about this," she scolded gently. "It is just a calendar conflict. We are trying to navigate a very complicated season for your sister. You need to be the mature one right now." The verdict had been handed down. Over the next 14 days, the mail carrier brought a steady stream of thick textured envelopes back to my duplex. I opened them one by one. They were the response cards I had so carefully designed. One by one, the boxes for joyfully declines were checked. Uncle David and Aunt Sarah, Cousin Melissa, the relatives from Atlanta, the cousins from Memphis. Nearly every single branch of the Harrison family tree withered and detached itself from my life. They chose the Champagne Tower. They chose the Wexler name. On the final Friday of the month, exactly 3 weeks before the wedding, I sat on my sofa with Dean by my side. He held my hand in his jaw clenched tight in silent fury. I opened my phone and went to the main family group chat. I typed out one final definitive message. I listed the date, the exact time of the ceremony, and the address of the mountain lodge. I finished the message with a single unadorned sentence. I hope the people who promised me they would be there still mean it. I pressed send. The message delivered. I watched the receipts populate as dozens of my relatives opened the text. I sat there for 1 hour, then 2 hours. The screen remained dark. Absolutely no one replied. The morning of the wedding arrived with a pale cold fog resting heavy over the Asheville pines. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating against the wooden nightstand. It was 800. The caller ID displayed my father's name. When I answered, the background noise on his end was a chaotic blend of clinking silverware and loud, unfamiliar voices. WDE cleared his throat. He did not ask how I was feeling or wish me well. He simply stated that he could not make the drive. He explained that Grant's family luncheon and the subsequent party schedule had gotten more complicated than expected. He used the word complicated as a shield, a polite substitute for the truth. In one brutal crystalline instant, the fragile promise I had carried for months shattered completely. I realized with absolute clarity that my father's word was never stronger than his paralyzing fear of disappointing richer people. He was terrified of losing his seat at a table that did not even belong to him. I did not argue or cry. I simply hung up the phone. 10 minutes later, my mother called. Her approach was softer, draped in a thin veil of maternal fatigue, but the message was equally cruel. Please do not make today harder than it already is. She sighed into the receiver. She was entirely blind to the irony of asking the bride to comfort the mother who was abandoning her. I told her goodbye and turned the phone face down on the mattress. I got dressed in the quiet stillness of the mountain lodge with Naomi by my side. The room smelled of old cedar and fresh rain. Naomi did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell me that everything happens for a reason. She simply stood behind me, her hands steady, and carefully zipped up the back of my simple silk gown. I walked over to the window and looked out at the bluff. Below us, the 56 white wooden chairs sat arranged in perfect symmetrical rows upon the wet grass. The mountain wind moved through them, knocking a few over. Without people to fill them, the chairs no longer looked celebratory. They looked stark and accusatory, like bleached bones, left out in the sun. They were a physical monument to everyone who had decided I was not worth the drive. While Naomi went downstairs to coordinate with the caterer, I sat on the edge of a velvet armchair against every instinct of self-preservation. I picked up my phone and opened social media. Tinsley's profile was the first to appear. Her story was a barrage of movement and noise. I saw sweeping panoramic skyline views from the Wexler Hotel rooftop. I saw towering pyramids of expensive champagne glasses catching the late afternoon light. In the center of it all was a candid photo of Tinsley and Grant laughing brightly. The caption beneath the photo read, "So grateful for everyone who showed up." The words felt like a physical blow to my ribs. It was not just a thank you to her guests. It was a deliberate public declaration of victory. She was ensuring the world knew she had won the attendance war. I put the phone away and walked downstairs. When I stepped out onto the back porch, the reality of my wedding day came into sharp focus. Out of the 56 chairs, exactly 11 were occupied. Naomi was there in the front row. 2 of Dean's oldest friends from college sat behind her. My former coworker, the only person from my previous office who truly knew me, sat near the aisle. Dean's cousin had flown in from the coast. The officiant stood near the front. The rest were a small handful of people who had traveled up the mountains simply because they loved us, not because there was an open bar, and certainly not because anyone important might be watching them. There were no Harrisons. There were no Wexlers. There was only the quiet, undeniable truth of who actually cared. The acoustic guitar music began to play from a small portable speaker. It was time. I walked down the wooden steps and reached the start of the grassy aisle. I stood there alone, the cool wind tugging at the hem of my dress. I took a deep breath, preparing to make the walk by myself. Then I heard the soft crunch of boots on the gravel behind me. It was Iris Maddox. Iris was the widowed owner of the Cedar Lodge, a retired park ranger with deep lines around her eyes and hands calloused from decades of hard work. She had watched me hold myself together all week, observing my quiet grief as I arranged flowers and checked the mail for replies that never came. Iris stepped up beside me, wearing a simple linen suit. She did not offer a pitying smile. Instead, she firmly offered her arm. "Someone who keeps her word should walk with you," she said, her voice rough like tree bark, but incredibly warm. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. I looped my arm through hers. Her presence was solid, anchoring me to the earth as we walked past the rows of empty chairs together. At the end of the aisle, standing beneath the reclaimed wood arbor he had built with his own hands, was Dean. He wore a dark charcoal suit, and the way he looked at me stripped away every ounce of humiliation I had felt that morning. The ceremony was incredibly brief. It was small, raw, and undeniably real. We did not read from a script. We spoke our handwritten vows into the mountain wind, promising to protect each other, to build a quiet life, and to never treat our love as a performance. When the officiant pronounced us married, Dean kissed me, and for the first time in my life, I felt entirely visible. The reception that followed was nothing like the high society galas my parents worshipped. We pushed the heavy wooden tables together on the lodge patio. We ate smoked barbecue on thick paper plates and cut into a dense, rich bourbon cake that Naomi had picked up from a local bakery. We drank cold beer from glass bottles. We played our favorite songs through cheap speakers, our voices echoing out over the dark valley. There was no polite, restrained networking. There was only loud, genuine laughter. I danced with Dean under the string lights, realizing that profound joy can indeed exist in the very same space as profound humiliation. The empty chairs no longer mattered, because the 11 people who stayed filled the entire mountain with their warmth. Late that night, long after the last guest had gone to bed, and the fire had died down to glowing embers, I sat alone on the edge of our bed in the bridal suite. Dean was in the bathroom washing his face. The room was perfectly silent. I picked up my phone one final time. I opened the Nashville rooftop photos again. I looked at the images of my parents, smiling wide, holding crystal glasses. I looked at Tinsley glowing in her designer dress. I looked at Grant appearing incredibly triumphant, the wealthy orchestrator of my family's complete surrender. I studied their faces, searching for any trace of guilt, any shadow of regret for where they were not. I found nothing. They looked exactly like people who had gotten exactly what they wanted. I locked the screen and set the phone down on the nightstand. A profound shift occurred in my chest. The heavy, suffocating ache of rejection finally dissolved, replaced by a cold, protective armor. I decided in the quiet dark of that mountain cabin that I was entirely done begging people to choose me. 7 full days passed since we packed our car and drove down the mountain. We returned to our quiet duplex in Chattanooga, stepping back into the rhythm of our normal lives. The silence from Nashville was absolute. It was not the heavy, awkward silence of people who knew they had caused a profound injury. It was the light, breezy silence of people who considered skipping my wedding to be nothing more than a minor scheduling detail that had now been successfully resolved. My family had attended the party they deemed important. The conflicting weekend was officially over, and they fully expected me to simply fall back into line without asking any difficult questions. It was as if my wedding was not a wound, but merely an administrative oversight that required no further discussion. On the evening of the 7th day, I sat at my kitchen counter and typed out one final message to Wade and Elaine. I did not draft a long, emotional paragraph. I simply wrote that I appreciated them finally making their true priorities entirely clear and that I needed space. I set the phone down on the counter. Less than 5 minutes later, my mother replied. She did not apologize. She did not offer a single word of regret or reflection. Instead, she typed out a quick scolding response, accusing me of holding grudges over spilled milk and begging me to stop living in the past. To her, my profound heartbreak was already ancient history, an inconvenience she had swiped away like an annoying calendar notification. I deleted the message thread entirely. I felt a strange cold calm settling over my ribs. The bleeding had finally stopped, leaving behind only tough, unyielding scar tissue. I was done waiting for an apology that would never arrive. While I was severing these final emotional tethers, Dean was operating in a completely different gear. Over the next 48 hours, he spent almost every waking moment on the phone. He paced the worn wooden floors of our living room, speaking in low, rapid tones. I heard him using terminology that belonged in corporate boardrooms, not our modest duplex. He spent hours talking to lawyers, reviewing complex legal structures, and discussing asset transfers. However, the most frequent name on his call log was Cellular Rowan. I knew of Cellular. I had always assumed she was simply one of Dean's early industry advisors, a mentor who occasionally helped him navigate the competitive hospitality tech space. She was a formidable, sharp-minded founder who had built and sold two massive platforms before she turned 40 years old. Dean always spoke of her with deep reverence, but I had absolutely no idea how deeply entangled she was in the current architecture of his business. On a Thursday night, the pacing finally stopped. Dean walked into the kitchen, gently closed my laptop, and pulled out a chair across from me. The air in the room felt suddenly dense, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a massive shift in the weather. He took a deep breath, looked me directly in the eyes, and finally told me the truth. He explained that for the past 6 months, Room Trace had not just been growing, it had been undergoing rigorous, exhausting acquisition due diligence. The buyer was Orison Atlas, a massive privately held travel platform company that was expanding aggressively into anti-fraud infrastructure. They did not just want Dean's software. They wanted to absorb his entire operational framework and integrate his algorithms into their global network. I sat there completely stunned, processing the magnitude of his words. I asked him why he had kept such a monumental secret during the most stressful year of our lives. Dean did not look away. He explained the strict non-disclosure agreements, the uncompromising legal mandates that required absolute silence until the ink was dry. But then his voice softened, losing its corporate edge and taking on a profound, heartbreaking tenderness. The legal contract was the official reason, he said quietly, reaching across the table to hold my hands. But the real reason was your family. I knew exactly what would happen if word leaked out. If your father or Tinsley caught even a faint scent of the money on the table before our wedding day, they would have abandoned Grant Wexler's rooftop in a heartbeat. They would have driven up that mountain and filled the front row of those cedar chairs. They would have toasted to us, smiled for the cameras, and pretended to offer a deep, profound respect they had absolutely never earned. He swallowed hard, his eyes fiercely protective. I could not let them do that to you. I wanted you to have one thing in your life that belonged entirely to us. Something completely pure before anyone else tried to put a price tag on it. I wanted us to know exactly who would show up for us when they thought we had nothing to offer them. The breath left my lungs. The sheer scale of the financial deal was shocking, but the protective architecture of his silence was what broke me open. He had willingly absorbed my family's relentless condescension for months. He had sat at the Thanksgiving table and let my father humiliate him in front of a dozen relatives, all while knowing he held a winning hand simply to protect the integrity of my wedding day. He had traded his own ego to ensure my reality was authentic. The next morning, the reality of our new life fully materialized. Celia Rowan called me directly. Her voice was warm, but it carried the undeniable weight of a woman who commands empires. She confirmed every single detail Dean had shared. She walked me through the numbers, and I had to sit down on the edge of the sofa to keep my balance. There was a massive equity payout. There was a multi-year retention bonus designed specifically to keep Dean at the helm of the engineering team. There was a designated leadership role for him within Orison Atlas and a long-term financial upside that was significant enough to permanently change the trajectory of our entire lives. We were no longer simply comfortable. We were crossing into a stratosphere of wealth that the Wexler family only pretended to possess through heavy leverage and debt. Before ending the call, Cellular shifted her tone from business to personal celebration. She told me, that she had been incredibly angry on my behalf when she learned about the empty chairs at my mountain ceremony. As a personal wedding gift to us, she was offering full unrestricted access to Villa Bella Coster. It was not a commercial hotel you could simply book online. It was a sprawling historic executive retreat situated directly on the shores of Lake Como in Italy. The property was owned through a labyrinth of Orison Atlas holding entities and was strictly reserved for top-level corporate hosts, senior founders, and elite private gatherings. She offered us 14 days complete with private staff, a dedicated boat captain, and absolute seclusion. When I hung up the phone, I looked around our small rented duplex with its leaky coffee maker and its cramped floor plan. I felt a sudden sharp spike of vertigo. My entire life, I had been trained to occupy the smallest possible amount of physical and emotional space. I had been taught to ask for nothing, to accept the tiny scraps of attention my family threw my way, and to feel incredibly guilty if I ever desired more. The prospect of flying across the world to stay in an Italian villa built for billionaires felt terrifying. It felt like an arrogant costume I had no right to wear. I hesitated for exactly one night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, seized by that same familiar, suffocating urge to retreat into myself, to pass on the trip, and to remain tucked away in the quiet corners where life felt safe and predictable. But as the sun began to rise, casting a pale, golden light across the bedroom walls, the protective armor I had forged on my wedding night locked firmly into place. I thought about Tinsley standing on that Nashville rooftop drinking champagne and celebrating my absence. I thought about my mother telling me not to be dramatic about my own heartbreak. I realized that rejecting this gift would just be another way of punishing myself to maintain the status quo. I turned to Dean, who was sleeping peacefully beside me, and made a silent, unshakable vow. I was completely finished, making myself smaller so the people who abandoned me did not have to feel uncomfortable. We were packing our bags. We traveled for nearly 20 hours before finally arriving at Villa Bella Coster just as the late afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Italian Alps. The long journey dissolved the moment we stepped off the polished wooden water taxi and onto the private dock. The estate was completely breathtaking, but what stunned me the most was the profound restraint of the place. There were no flashing neon signs, no velvet ropes, and no towering glass lobbies designed to make guests feel small or inadequate. Instead, we were greeted by ancient stone terraces carved seamlessly into the steep hillside, surrounded by thick groves of gnarled olive trees that had likely stood there for hundreds of years. Inside the villa, the floors were made of cool, dark wood that creaked softly under our footsteps, holding the history of the house. Every morning, the rich scent of freshly baked bread drifted up from the kitchen right at dawn, mingling with the crisp breeze rolling off Lake Como. Our suite overlooked a view of the deep blue water that was so perfectly calm, it barely felt real. I spent the first 3 days simply unlearning the physical tension I had carried in my shoulders for over 30 years. I could not help but contrast this environment with the flashy, desperate world my sister constantly performed online. Tinsley and the Wexler family defined luxury entirely by how many people were forced to watch them consume it. Their version of wealth was loud, abrasive, heavily mortgaged, and constantly demanding external validation. Villa Bella Coster was the exact opposite. This level of luxury felt quiet, deeply earned, and incredibly private. It was a space so secure in its own immense value that it did not need an audience to prove it existed. For the first time in my life, I felt safe enough to actually trust my surroundings. On the fourth evening of our stay, the quiet seclusion shifted. Dean was formally invited to an intimate dinner hosted by the Orison Atlas leadership team, who were holding a private executive retreat at a neighboring estate across the water. A few prominent industry guests and legal advisors were also in attendance. I dressed carefully in a simple dark navy silk dress, fully expecting to spend the next 4 hours playing the traditional decorative role of the supportive new spouse. I assumed my only job was to smile politely, nod at the appropriate intervals, and remain entirely unremarkable while the men at the table discussed the future of global travel infrastructure. The dinner took place on a sprawling stone patio illuminated by dozens of thick white candles and a canopy of stars. The conversation flowed easily through complex market trends, aggressive acquisition strategies, and software architecture. About 2 hours into the meal, the tone of the table grew serious. The topic shifted sharply toward integration challenges. A senior vice president leaned forward, expressing deep concern about vendor risk exposure and the massive compliance blind spots that inevitably occur when two highly complex data systems merge. He was specifically worried about the vulnerabilities in tracking third-party access points, citing potential liabilities that could cost the company millions of dollars in regulatory fines. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I recognized the exact structural flaw he was describing. It was the very foundation of my daily work. Without asking for permission, and without a single trace of the hesitation my family had ingrained in me, I simply spoke up. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the white linen tablecloth, and broke down the exact nature of the liability. Using my extensive background as a senior compliance coordinator at Ironroot Systems, I outlined the specific framework required to mitigate third-party risk during large-scale data migrations. I explained the absolute necessity of aggressive early-stage auditing and detailed how to build an automated containment protocol that would instantly freeze compromised vendor endpoints before any digital infection could spread through the Orison Atlas network. I spoke uninterrupted for perhaps 4 solid minutes. When I finished my explanation, the entire table was perfectly silent. I instinctively braced myself for the familiar patronizing chuckle my father would have delivered or the swift, embarrassed change of subject my mother would have initiated to silence me. Instead, the senior vice president nodded slowly, pulled out a silver pen from his jacket pocket, and asked me to repeat my second point so he could write it down. The chief executive officer asked me a highly technical follow-up question regarding strict regulatory compliance in the European market, which I answered with absolute certainty. For the very first time in my adult life, a table full of strangers who held actual immense power responded to me as if my profound competence was an obvious fact rather than a shocking anomaly. They did not treat me like an accessory. They treated me like a genuine authority. Later that evening, as the dinner party began to wind down and guests moved toward the waiting boats, Cellular Rowan quietly pulled me aside. We stood near the edge of the stone balustrade, looking out at the moonlight reflecting off the dark surface of the lake. She held a heavy crystal glass of red wine and studied me with a sharp, approving gaze. "Dean is an absolute visionary," Cellular said smoothly, the cool night air catching her voice. "He built a brilliant product from the ground up. But listening to you at that table tonight, it became incredibly clear to me that while he knows exactly how to build the engine, you are the one who understands exactly how to armor it and protect its scale. That specific combination of skills under one roof is extraordinarily rare." Cellular did not stop at a compliment. Right there on the terrace, she offered me a seat at the table. She formally invited me to consult as the lead compliance architect on the room trace integration planning committee for Orison Atlas effectively immediately after our honeymoon concluded. The compensation she casually mentioned was staggering, but the money was entirely secondary. It was a monumental professional breakthrough that belonged entirely to me. It was not a favor granted through my marriage, and it certainly was not a hollow nepotism role manufactured to buy loyalty. It was a direct, undeniable validation of my own intellect. The remaining days of our honeymoon felt completely untethered from the heavy gravity of my past. Dean and I spent our afternoons walking hand in hand through the narrow, winding cobblestone streets of the small lakeside villages. We ate fresh pasta, drank rich espresso, and occasionally made quiet, deeply satisfying jokes about the people who had recently called him unemployed. We laughed out loud about Wade demanding to know when Dean would finally secure a real job with a payroll department, marveling at the delicious irony that Dean now possessed a controlling stake in a corporation that likely owned the very buildings Wade desperately wanted to consult for. With every passing hour, the emotional distance from Nashville widened into a vast, unbridgeable ocean. It evolved from a painful separation into something profoundly liberating. On our final evening at Villa Bella Coster, just as the Italian sky turned a deep, bruised purple, we stood together out on our private bedroom terrace, Dean wrapped his strong arms around me from behind, resting his chin comfortably on my shoulder as we watched a few small boats cut through the water. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I had not posted a single update, checked a single timeline, or responded to a single message since the morning before our wedding. I opened the camera application and took one understated, naturally lit photo of us standing together against the breathtaking mountain backdrop. There were no towering champagne pyramids, no forced, agonizing poses, and no desperate pleas for social attention. We just looked fiercely happy, deeply grounded, and entirely at peace. I opened my social media profile, attached the single image, and typed out a short, perfectly measured caption: "Married the right man, grateful for the ones who meant it." I pressed the button to publish the post, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and turned around to kiss my husband, feeling entirely ready for whatever chaos the morning would bring. I woke up to a sound I had not heard in over 3 weeks: the heavy, persistent vibration of my phone rattling against the polished marble nightstand cut through the quiet Italian morning. The sun was just beginning to crest over the jagged peaks of the Alps, casting a pale, golden light across the heavy wooden floorboards of our suite. I reached over, still half asleep, and picked up the device. The lock screen was an absolute wall of digital desperation. It was not just a few scattered notifications. It was an avalanche. There were 47 unread text messages, 22 missed calls, and over a dozen frantic voice notes. The sheer volume of it did not feel human. It felt mechanical, like an algorithm that had suddenly realized a catastrophic error and was aggressively trying to self-correct. I sat up against the massive headboard, pulling the crisp white sheets over my legs, and began to scroll. My father was the very first in line. We did not bother to ask how I was doing, nor did he mention the wedding he had skipped. His message was entirely transactional, driven by a panicked need to categorize the environment I had casually displayed to the world. "Whose property is that in your photo?" he demanded. "That is not a commercial hotel terrace." "Who are you staying with?" Elaine's message arrived exactly 4 minutes after his. She executed a complete, breathtaking pivot from her previous scolding. The mother who had recently accused me of holding grudges over spilt milk was suddenly radiating manufactured warmth. "Darling, the photo is absolutely stunning," she typed. "We need to plan a huge celebratory dinner the exact moment you two return home. We have so much to catch up on." She wanted to immediately bask in a glow she had spent months actively trying to extinguish. The extended relatives were the most pathetic to read. These were the cousins who had actively ignored my hand-painted invitations. The aunts and uncles who had left those 56-seater chairs empty to drink Grant Wexler's champagne. They were now flooding my inbox with red heart emojis and exclamation points. "I always knew Dean was destined to do incredible things," wrote a cousin from Memphis who had once loudly complained about Dean's worn leather shoes. The revisionist history was happening in real time. They were aggressively rewriting their own memories to align with my new undeniable reality. But Tinsley's messages were the true masterpiece of the morning. They arrived in 3 distinct phases, mapping her psychological collapse perfectly across the screen. The first phase was raw, unfiltered confusion. "Are you in Italy?" she asked at exactly 6:00 in the morning, her local time. 45 minutes later, the confusion morphed into deep suspicion. She had clearly been zooming in on the background of my photo, analyzing the stonework. "How did you get access to that terrace?" "That is a private corporate retreat. Grant says you cannot just book that." Finally, another hour later, her facade completely shattered into a panicked, frantic command. "Call me immediately." Tinsley's entire sense of self, her absolute authority within the Harrison family, depended on her always understanding the social hierarchy before anyone else did. She was suddenly flying completely blind, and the loss of control was visibly terrifying to her. Across the bedroom, Dean's phone began to vibrate on the opposite nightstand. He rolled over, picked it up, and squinted at the bright screen. He let out a short, incredibly hollow laugh and handed the phone across the bed to me. It was a direct message from Grant Wexler. The tone was sickeningly familiar, draped in a fake, masculine camaraderie that Grant had never once extended to my husband before. "Hey, buddy," Grant wrote. Looks like you two are enjoying the lake. Incredible news today. I just saw the industry wire. We really need to get together and talk shop soon. Wexler Properties could definitely use a platform like Room Trace in our portfolio. It was breathtakingly audacious. Grant was happily fishing for proprietary information, completely bypassing the fact that his family had actively participated in humiliating us just weeks prior. He was pretending the knife in our backs was just a friendly pat on the shoulder. The puzzle pieces clicked firmly into place. I opened a web browser and navigated to the major hospitality trade outlets. There it was, dominating the front page of the leading financial technology news site. A massive acquisition announcement had been published at dawn, Eastern Standard Time. The headline was bold, black, and completely unavoidable. Artisan Atlas had officially acquired Room Trace. The extensive article specifically named Dean as the brilliant solo founder and featured a glowing, highly complimentary quote from Celia Rowan regarding the revolutionary future of fraud prevention in global hospitality systems. The financial terms were not explicitly detailed, but the article prominently noted it was one of the largest private tech acquisitions of the entire fiscal quarter. Sitting there in the quiet dawn, I pictured the collective mourning occurring back in Tennessee. I could almost physically see the Harrison family piecing the narrative together over their morning coffee. The horrifying realization was settling over them in humiliating real-time clarity. The quiet man in the plain shirts, the man they had relentlessly dismissed and mocked at the Thanksgiving table, had just vaulted into a level of legitimate success they could not possibly belittle. He held power that Grant Wexler could only dream of borrowing, and the daughter they had deemed too unimportant to celebrate. The daughter, whose wedding day was traded for an audition, was currently standing beside him on a billionaire's terrace in Europe. They had bet their entire social standing on the wrong horse, and the race was being broadcast on every screen they owned. I sat there for nearly an hour reading every single message. I listened to every frantic voice note. I did not reply to a single one of them. I let myself absorb the stark, unvarnished ugliness of it all. I felt the profound emptiness of conditional love, recognizing exactly how quickly human affection magically appears, the exact second that status and wealth do. It was emotionally cold, but it was the most deeply satisfying feeling I had ever experienced. The lingering ghosts of my childhood neediness evaporated completely, burned away by the harsh, clarifying light of their transparent greed. However, I knew I could not leave the silence open to their interpretation. The Harrisons would view my silence as an invitation to simply keep trying until they wore me down. I opened the main Harrison family group chat. This was the exact same digital room where my final plea for attendance had been met with dead, suffocating air. I opened the keyboard and typed out one carefully measured surgical note. I stated the facts without offering a single ounce of emotion for them to feed on. The wedding mattered. I typed, my thumbs moving steadily across the glass. The betrayal was entirely deliberate. I see clearly how quickly things change when there is an announcement in the trade papers. I will not discuss anything regarding my life, my husband, or this family until I'm entirely ready. Nobody should mistake my current access for future forgiveness. I pressed send. I watched the text bubble appear on the screen. I did not wait to watch the read receipts populate. I did not care who saw it first or how loudly they gasped in their suburban kitchens. I locked the screen, turned the notification volume all the way down, and tossed the device onto the nightstand. I stood up, smoothed out my silk pajamas, walked over to my husband, and took his warm hand. We dressed quietly, left the suite, and walked down the ancient stone steps toward the private dock where the wooden boat was waiting for us. We stepped aboard, untied the heavy ropes, and drifted out onto the deep, incredibly calm waters of Lake Company. The morning air was crisp and clean. For the first time in my entire life, I chose the vast, quiet water over the frantic, demanding noise of my family. We returned to Chattanooga just as the heavy summer humidity began to settle over the Tennessee Valley. The transition from the pristine Italian chaws back to our cramped duplex could have felt jarring, but instead it felt incredibly grounding. We were packing moving boxes, preparing to leave the uneven floorboards and the leaky sink behind for good. A new chapter had officially commenced. Within 48 hours of our return, I formally accepted the consulting role with Orison Atlas. I submitted my resignation at Ironroot Systems, handed over my complex compliance portfolios, and stepped into a space that was entirely my own. For the very first time in my 32 years on this earth, my career was expanding rapidly simply because someone intelligent noticed exactly what my mind could do rather than who I was related to or how quiet I could be. I was given a team, a substantial budget, and absolute authority over the integration framework. During our second week back, the narrative my family had so carefully constructed began to unravel in the public square. A highly respected Southern business podcast, one that was religiously consumed by the exact demographic of old money investors my parents desperately worshipped, released a lengthy audio profile on Dean and the room trace acquisition. The host spent over an hour diving into the architecture of the platform. Near the end of the interview, the host asked Dean how he managed to navigate the crushing regulatory hurdles in the early days when he had absolutely no capital. Dean did not hesitate. His voice, steady and clear over the microphone, drifted through the speakers of my laptop. He stated almost in passing that the entire early compliance structure and the foundational legal documentation were single-handedly built by his wife. He explained that I had architected the risk mitigation protocols late at night at our kitchen table, long before a single investor believed the company would ever matter. The social shockwave was immediate. The Harrisons, realizing that their prolonged cruelty was now clashing violently with our highly public success, instantly began revising their own memories. They engaged in a frantic campaign of historical fiction. Through Naomi, I heard the ridiculous stories my parents were spinning. They were actively telling our extended relatives that they had always been concerned, but fundamentally supportive of our unconventional journey. They claimed that skipping my wedding was just an unfortunate, unavoidable logistical tragedy rather than a calculated financial calculation. Tinsley, meanwhile, engaged in a desperate digital retreat. She was acutely aware that the social optics had shifted dramatically out of her favor. I noticed that she was quietly, methodically deleting the vast majority of the engagement party content that had once completely flooded her social media feeds. The towering champagne pyramids, the triumphant captions, and the sweeping skyline views of the Wexler Hotel were scrubbed from the internet. She sensed that flaunting a party funded by borrowed money while her ignored sister was being celebrated in international business circles was a catastrophic look. Her authority was evaporating, and she was trying to erase the evidence of her arrogance before anyone else noticed. But the eraser was too late, and the trouble surrounding the Wexler empire was becoming impossible to hide. The cracks in their foundation did not start as a public collapse. They began as quiet, persistent whispers within the regional hospitality industry, rumors that quickly escalated into loud, unavoidable alarms. Word leaked out about massive expansion debt that the family could no longer service. Several of their high-profile boutique hotel renovations completely stalled, leaving half-finished lobbies sitting empty for months. There were aggressive vendor disputes with local contractors filing liens for unpaid invoices. The polished, unassailable image of Grant's family brand was a fragile illusion. They were suffocating under the weight of aggressive, predatory lending. They were not incredibly wealthy. They were just incredibly leveraged. As the Wexler financial ecosystem began to wither, the artificial weather system that had dictated my family's behavior violently reversed its course. The manufactured prosperity my parents had traded my wedding day to secure dried up overnight. WDE's highly compensated, largely undefined consulting role with the Wexler development projects was quietly terminated as Grant's father desperately slashed operational budgets. Elaine suddenly lost the premium corporate health insurance perks and the country club access she had grown so incredibly used to flaunting. Panic is a highly predictable emotion as their financial security crumbled. The very same family members who had cheerfully abandoned me on a mountain in North Carolina suddenly felt an overwhelming urgent need to reestablish emotional contact. They knew they could not simply ask the newly wealthy tech founder and his wife for a massive loan out of nowhere. They needed to pave the road first. They needed to fabricate a narrative of family healing before they could comfortably pivot to asking for practical help. Over the course of 3 weeks, Dean and I received half a dozen dinner invitations. They arrived via text message and overly cheerful voicemails. Wade suggested grabbing a casual steak dinner to catch up on old times. Elaine left a breathy voice note expressing deep maternal concern, claiming she just missed seeing my face and wanted to host a nostalgic Sunday brunch to heal the past. I declined every single invitation. I did not argue with them, and I did not write long, emotional paragraphs explaining my lingering pain. I was flawlessly perfectly polite. I simply stated that our schedules were currently full and that we were unavailable. I offered absolutely no alternative dates by denying them physical access to our lives. I systematically stripped away their favorite defensive weapon. The Harrisons had always used forced proximity and loud family gatherings to dull accountability, believing that if we all just sat in the same room and ate a meal together, the past would magically erase itself. I refused to give them that room. I forced them to sit alone with the deafening silence of their own consequences. The ultimate vindication, however, did not come from an ignored text message. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening, carried in the hands of my best friend. Naomi knocked on the door of our duplex, her coat dripping wet, clutching a thick manila folder against her chest. She walked directly into the kitchen, dropped the folder onto the counter, and took a slow, heavy breath. She had been digging through county property records and public financial filings, utilizing the same relentless investigative skills she applied to her toughest legal cases. She opened the folder and spread a series of officially stamped documents across the countertop. The paperwork detailed a massive home equity line of credit that Wade had taken out against my childhood home. The dates on the bank approvals were what made the blood freeze in my veins. The loans were initiated and fully approved during the exact same months I was handling my save the dates. Naomi traced the public financial breadcrumbs with her index finger, showing how a significant portion of that newly borrowed money appeared directly connected to large non-refundable deposits made to national event vendors. The reality of the paperwork was devastating. My father had not simply chosen to attend a party hosted by richer people. He had secretly plunged his own financial life into massive, dangerous debt, specifically to fund Tinsley's elaborate engagement event. He had borrowed thousands upon thousands of dollars to construct a floorless social stage, desperately hoping to secure Grant's family money through marriage. I stared at the black ink on the county records. The entire narrative crystallized. My small, inexpensive mountain wedding was not just an inconvenience to them. It was completely useless. It offered them no return on investment, no social leverage, and no access to generational wealth. My wedding day was intentionally sacrificed so my parents and my sister could execute a high-stakes financial audition. They had wagered everything they owned on the Wexler name, and now the bill was finally coming due. My father's pride did not collapse with a dramatic explosion. It eroded entirely over a brief, pathetic phone call on a Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting at my dining table reviewing a complex compliance framework for Orison Atlas when my phone vibrated. Wade's name illuminated the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but the sheer volume of his recent attempts to reach me sparked a clinical curiosity about exactly how desperate his situation had become. I answered the call. There was no polite preamble, no manufactured nostalgia about my childhood, and absolutely no pretense that he simply wanted to hear his daughter's voice. WDE sounded hollow, his vocal cords strained by a completely different kind of exhaustion. He told me, his voice shaking terribly, that the bank was actively threatening foreclosure. The home equity line of credit he had taken out against my childhood home was completely maxed out, and the massive monthly minimums had become entirely impossible for him to service. I let him speak, listening to the frantic cadence of a man who realized his bluff had finally been called by the universe. I did not offer him a single syllable of comfort. I simply asked him why he took out the massive loan in the first place. I already knew the answer from the public financial filings Naomi had uncovered, but I needed to force him to say the words out loud. The silence on the line grew incredibly heavy. When Wade finally spoke, the remaining facade of the Harrison family mythology crumbled into dust. He confessed that the massive national engagement event was never just a celebratory party. It was a highly calculated, heavily funded theatrical production staged for an audience of exactly one person. Her name was Lenore Wexler. Lenore was Grant's formidable aunt, the primary family trustee who entirely controlled the timing and the distribution of a multi-million-dollar trust release. She was notoriously strict, intensely judgmental, and she wanted to see whether Tinsley possessed the social endurance and the aesthetic polish required to seamlessly represent the prestigious Wexler brand. Wade admitted, his voice dropping to a shameful whisper, that Lenore was only available to travel to Tennessee on that specific weekend in late spring. Tinsley's future, and by extension my parents' desperate bid for permanent financial elevation, completely hinged on proving they could host an impeccably wealthy crowd without flinching. I sat perfectly still, the phone pressed hard against my ear. The true magnitude of the betrayal settled over me like a heavy suffocating blanket. My wedding day was not merely overshadowed by a careless scheduling conflict. It was knowingly, deliberately cannibalized. They threw my joy onto an altar and sacrificed it so my sister could pass a high-stakes social and financial test in front of the people holding the purse strings. They traded my milestone for an audition. I hung up the phone without making a single promise to Wade. Less than 2 hours later, my phone rang again. This time it was Tinsley. She began the conversation with theatrical sobbing, a practice performance she had honed over decades, designed specifically to elicit immediate sympathy. She cried loudly about the crushing stress of the Wexler family debts, the unbearable pressure of maintaining her flawless public image, and how incredibly unfair the world was being to her. I remained entirely silent, refusing to offer the soothing reassurances she was so accustomed to extracting from me. Deprived of the emotional oxygen she expected, her sorrow rapidly metastasized into fierce, venomous entitlement. Her tears vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, demanding tone. She insisted that Dean and I possessed more money than we could ever possibly spend, and that we were being incredibly cruel by sitting back and watching our own parents suffer. She stated with absolute breathtaking arrogance that we could solve this entire nightmare with one simple wire transfer. I let her finish her desperate pitch. Then I asked her the single question she could not possibly dodge, the question that had been burning a hole in my chest since the moment I saw those empty white chairs blowing in the mountain wind. "Did you choose my wedding day?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly low and perfectly steady. "Because you knew I was the one person in this family who would bleed quietly." Tinsley choked on her breath. She tried to deflect, stammering frantically about calendar logistics and strict venue constraints, but I refused to let her pivot away from the blade. I asked it again, demanding a direct answer. Cornered, exhausted, and finally stripped of her usual defense mechanisms, Tinsley surrendered the ugly truth. She said yes in substance, if not in elegance. She practically screamed that I had always made things easier for everyone else because I was perfectly capable of absorbing pain without creating a massive public scandal. She deeply resented me for my resilience, and because she knew I would survive the heartbreak without burning the house down, she decided I was the safest casualty. I ended the call immediately, feeling a strange, profound sense of closure. The ghost haunting my childhood had finally been dragged into the light and named. While the Harrison women were attempting to extract emotional and financial concessions from me, Grant Wexler was simultaneously attempting to execute a parallel maneuver against my husband. The very next morning, Dean showed me a lengthy, aggressively cheerful email he had received directly from Grant. Grant was pretending that the ongoing family tension was simply a minor emotional misunderstanding between the women. He bypassed the drama entirely and pitched Dean on a massive exclusive fraud control partnership. He proposed integrating the room trace architecture across the entire sinking portfolio of Wexler properties. He dressed the pitch up in slick corporate synergy buzzwords, but the underlying financial desperation was painfully transparent. Grant was trying to use Roomtrack's flawless industry reputation to instantly stabilize his own crumbling operations. He still viewed my marriage not as a union of two human beings, but as a highly lucrative resource pipeline that he was inherently entitled to tap into. Dean did not consult a public relations team, nor did he agonized over the response. His refusal was absolute, cold, and entirely uncompromising. He drafted a very brief reply, stating that Orison Atlas maintained incredibly strict standards regarding vendor risk and ethical liability. He informed Grant that mixing their advanced engineering with an organization that routinely weaponized family relationships for financial gain would completely poison everything he and I had built together. Dean hit send, permanently locking the Wexler family out of our professional ecosystem. The external pressure on Wade and Elaine was mounting by the hour. The bank was officially threatening to initiate formal foreclosure proceedings within 30 days. The local social circles were whispering loudly about their collapse. The walls were completely closing in on the oversized house they had leveraged to buy an illusion. That evening, I sent a single definitive message to my parents. I did not offer a blind wire transfer. I did not offer hollow forgiveness. I offered them exactly one narrow path forward. I told them that if there was going to be any financial intervention whatsoever regarding the house, it would not happen over the phone, and it certainly would not happen through passive-aggressive text messages. It would only happen after a mandatory face-to-face meeting. I dictated the terms with the cold precision of a corporate auditor. The meeting would take place in their living room. Naomi would be present as my legal counsel and official witness. Every single financial document, every bank statement, and every unpaid invoice would be laid out completely bare on the coffee table. Most importantly, I demanded that the absolute truth be spoken plainly into the room. There would be no more rewriting history, no more softening the betrayal, and no more pretending that my wedding was anything less than deliberate collateral damage. If they wanted a lifeline to survive the storm they created, they had to look me directly in the eye and confess exactly what they did to me with absolutely no revisions. The heavy oak front door of my childhood home was unlocked when we arrived on Thursday evening. I pushed it open and stepped into the sprawling, over-decorated foyer. The air inside smelled of expensive vanilla candles and quiet desperation. My parents and my sister were already gathered in the formal living room. They had arranged themselves on the plush cream sofas, looking expectant and tragically hopeful. There was a silver tray with a freshly prepared tea service sitting on the mahogany coffee table. They had genuinely convinced themselves that I was arriving softened by my recent financial success, ready to play the familiar role of the forgiving, accommodating daughter. They expected tears, a few hollow apologies, and a heartwarming reconciliation that would end with me quietly writing a massive check to save them all from absolute ruin. Instead, I walked into the room flanked by Dean Naomi and a sharply dressed corporate attorney named David. We did not sit down. David stepped forward and placed a thick, heavy leather folder directly onto the center of the coffee table, pushing the silver tea tray aside. The dull thud of the paperwork hitting the wood instantly changed the entire temperature of the room. My mother pulled her silk shawl tighter around her shoulders. Tinsley shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting frantically between Naomi and the attorney. I stood near the stone fireplace, resting my hand lightly on the cold mantel, and looked at the family that had happily traded my joy for a cocktail party. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. True power does not require volume. It only requires absolute clarity. I opened the folder. I started laying out the physical evidence of their betrayal piece by piece across the glass table. I presented the precise timeline, spelling out the dates with surgical precision. I showed them the printed screenshots of Tinsley lobbying our relatives, reducing my sacred vows to a casual mountain weekend. I laid out the stark financial records Naomi had pulled, highlighting the massive home equity line Wade had authorized exactly 8 weeks before my wedding invitations were mailed. Finally, I placed a copy of the Wexler family trust structure on the table, detailing the specific pressure coming from Grant's aunt, Lenora. I looked directly at my father and stated the undeniable truth of the room. I told him that my wedding was not merely overshadowed by a busy social calendar. It was knowingly and deliberately cannibalized. I was treated as acceptable collateral damage in Tinsley's desperate bid to secure the Wexler approval and the generational money that came with it. WDE stared at the documents. His face turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. For the very first time in my entire life, my father did not attempt to bluster his way out of accountability. The sheer weight of the paper crushed his pride entirely. He broke. His shoulders slumped forward and he buried his face in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. He admitted, his voice barely a rough whisper, that he had chosen access comfort and utter cowardice over his own daughter. He confessed the ugliest truth of all. He sat on a glamorous rooftop drinking imported wine, while I walked myself toward a marriage he simply did not deserve to witness. Elaine followed his confession. She did not offer empty excuses about complicated schedules. She looked down at her lap, her manicured fingers trembling slightly, and delivered a smaller but equally brutal admission. She told me that she had simply assumed I would forgive them. She said she relied entirely on the fact that I had always swallowed my pain to make the house run smoothly. Her fundamental assumption that my unconditional love was actually a limitless tolerance for abuse became its own profound form of cruelty. Tinsley, however, could not handle the quiet accountability. Deprived of her usual spotlight and cornered by the undeniable proof of her manipulation, she erupted. She stood up, her voice shrill and frantic, denying the financial motives and attempting to redirect the blame onto Grant's demanding family. But I simply stared at her, offering absolutely zero emotional reaction to her theatrics. My utter silence broke her completely. The manic energy drained from her posture, leaving behind the raw, insecure core she had spent her entire life trying to hide. She finally confessed the emotional truth that drove the entire sabotage. She looked at me, her face flushed with lingering anger and deep shame, and admitted that she simply could not tolerate it. She could not stomach the idea of me having a single 24-hour period where the entire room belonged entirely to me and no one was looking at Tinsley first. She sabotaged my wedding because she was terrified of briefly becoming the secondary character in our family dynamic. The air in the living room grew completely still. The truth was finally out, lying bare on the table alongside the bank statements. Tinsley took a ragged breath and asked how we were going to fix the Wexler debt. I looked at my older sister and delivered my verdict. I told her I absolutely refused to give her or Grant a single cent. There would be zero bailouts for the Wexler empire, zero business ties with Room Trace, and zero opportunities for them to mistake my money for a genuine reconciliation. Tinsley gasped, sinking back onto the sofa as the reality of her impending social collapse washed over her. Then I turned back to my parents. I offered them one narrowly tailored, strictly managed act of grace. I told them I would pay the exact amount of the bank lien currently threatening their home, effectively saving them from public foreclosure. However, the money would not touch their hands. It would be wired directly into an attorney-managed escrow account. The conditions of this rescue were absolute and non-negotiable. They were required to immediately list this oversized 5,000T monument to their ego on the housing market. They had to sell the property within 90 days, downsize into a modest, affordable home, and permanently sever all of their financial entanglements tied to Tinsley and Grant. Most importantly, I looked my mother directly in the eyes and told her that they were to never, under any circumstances, attempt to use me as the family's silent, compliant backup plan ever again. They had to learn how to survive the consequences of their own choices. WD nodded slowly, completely defeated, but entirely grateful for the lifeline. We left the house 10 minutes later, leaving the heavy folder on their table as a permanent reminder of the evening the power dynamic shifted forever. The story reaches its true conclusion exactly 12 months later. Dean and I were hosting our first anniversary dinner. We were no longer living in the cramped duplex. We had purchased and meticulously restored a beautiful, sprawling hillside home just outside the city limits of Chattanooga. It was a space filled with warm light, solid wood, and absolute peace. We invited a very small, carefully selected group of people to celebrate with us. 30 minutes before the first guests were scheduled to arrive, the doorbell rang. I opened the heavy front door and found Wade standing on the porch. He was dressed in a simple, inexpensive sweater, standing next to a modest sedan parked in our wide driveway. He was holding a large, unpretentious bouquet of fresh mountain wildflowers. He did not puff his chest out. He did not demand attention, and he offered absolutely no excuses for the past. He looked older, quieter, and fundamentally changed by the humbling reality of his downsized life. I accepted the flowers, thanked him, and invited my father inside. I guided him into the dining room where the long wooden table was beautifully set for the evening. I pulled out a specific wooden chair near the end of the table and told him to sit there. WDE sat down exactly where I told him to. He did not look around the room with the arrogant posture of a man who owned the space. He sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, looking around the beautiful home his daughter had built without his help. He was finally learning that he was never inherently entitled to my world. As I walked back toward the kitchen to join my husband, I realized that I no longer felt a single ounce of resentment. The deepest, most profound revenge was not screaming at them or watching them lose their money. The ultimate revenge was the quiet, unshakable reality that I now possess the absolute power to decide exactly who gets a chair at my table and exactly why they are allowed to stay. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So, please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey of finding strength and setting boundaries, please make sure to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and support the channel even more by pressing the hype button so this story can reach and empower many more people who might need to hear it. Thanks to all.